Welcome everyone to the Great Lakes Permaculture Design Collaborative.
We are a trio of permaculturists.
Rhonda Baird from Bloomington, Indiana.
William Faith from Chicago, Illinois.
Milton Dixon from Ann Arbor, Michigan.
We're teaming up to create a hands-on learning experience
that can catapult you into a regenerative practice of your own.
glpdc.info
will send you to the host of our next Permaculture Design Certificate course.
Welcome everyone to another episode of the Great Lakes Permaculture Design Collaborative. My name is Milton Dixon and I'm here with Rhonda Baird.
Hello.
And William Faith.
Hello.
And we are talking about livelihood. So every time we orient ourselves with the permaculture flower, so every petal can manifest as our livelihood. We can focus on one specifically, but we need all of them present to, really have a complete life. So the first slide that I have, I just wanted to start from thinking about what do we actually need. When we're talking about how are we going to meet those needs, we should probably have a pretty good picture of what those needs are before we start trying to meet them. If we're not clear about what those needs are, we're going to be flailing around in all sorts of different ways that don't benefit us and may actually harm us in the environment.
So I love this Abraham's Maslow's hierarchy of needs and then starting with the physical, and there's sort of a developmental piece around this too, where you start off as an infant and you need those physiological and safety and love and belonging, and it's only when you move into your childhood years and then into your teen years and onwards that you start to develop these higher needs. And if you wanted to go more deeply into some of this, you could look at the work of a Chilean economist, Manfred Max Neef, who pairs these with some like inner needs and outer needs, things we need as individuals and things we need in relationship.
For me, I think that a lot of people have gone beyond this work and added a lot of layers to it, but I like the simplicity of it and the fact that if the way I always look at it is each level of this is a certain point that you reach in life, and the level below that is something that you can kind of fall back on. If things fall apart on you, if difficult obstacles occur in your life, you always have the level beneath it to fall back on. And at the very base level, the physiological is just that essential thing that we need for life. And I would argue that there's a sizable chunk of the planet that live just at the physiological level, that don't really have access to the higher levels. But it's kind of an interesting measuring stick for what your real needs are at any given point.
Mm-hmm.
Ultimately, we do want everyone, and I would even argue that every being should be able to reach the point of self-actualization. That's maybe a paraphrasing of the goal of permaculture.
I was kind of thinking along the same lines and thinking that aim of supporting every individual in self-actualization speaks to not just people care, but really that third ethic of, our limits to consumption, but also distributing opportunities and resources so that people can live full lives. Absolutely
essential. But I'm always drawn back to that wonderful quote that I believe I'm paraphrasing at the moment, but how these base needs are very fundamental. That quote that the heart does not want for flowers while the belly wants for rice. Always going back to the basics, but ultimately moving towards self-actualization, definitely.
Yeah, it sounds so utopian. Not the quote you just paraphrased, but this idea that we're striving for this.
No less important.
Mm-hmm.
Utopian kind of seems maybe out of reach or sometimes silly, but shouldn't that what we be aiming for? Rather than what? Rather than like dystopian?
Right.
Right. We should try to move in that direction at least. It may not be achievable, may not be completely realistic, but we should move towards that.
Absolutely.
Well, so this next slide, we exist in a place already. We exist where we are. And to think about how our needs are met and what that looks like, what that makes the place look like, and how then that place contributes to our needs. So, in the lower right-hand corner, I have a picture of, this is where I used to live, Rogers Park. And above that is essentially that's how you get your food. You go to the supermarket. And that's about the only way it happens. Maybe you go to a farmer's market if you really have the ethics of farming and growing food in mind. So on the left is an overhead shot of a picture I happen to have. And above that, what a picture of a garden kind of in that situation might look like. And those are two completely different ways then of meeting virtually the same need. And they kind of create a very different space, each of them. So that's really what I wanted to emphasize, that these spaces that we live in limit what we're able to do or enable us.
I find that sometimes those same limitations can spur on fantastic levels of creativity. Working within limits can sometimes change the outcome just by working with what's there. Mm-hmm. In cities where you have a limited amount of horizontal space, a lot of people have learned to grow vertically. There's a lot of things that can come out of it. So those limitations, while at face value can seem really, really daunting, if you put your design hat on and really start working with it, there's a lot of fudgeability in there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and seeing in here, like, how do you meet your needs? And there's a lot of food and plant-based image here. But, if you think about those basic water, shelter, food, fire kinds of things, most of the housing is established already. Like, there aren't tons and tons of new houses being built, and permaculturists aren't always building them, And so we kind of have housing situations set up, and where we can get creative with that is sharing housing and retrofitting housing in creative ways. And there are more opportunities in an urban environment than there are in rural environments a lot of times. Just because you can more easily find like-minded individuals who are willing to try something. But, so you want to think about livelihood in terms of providing your housing and working with something existing in the climate and those limitations that Milton and William were talking about. You can do intensive gardening close to the house in most environments, but the productivity and capacity for slightly larger things is really dependent on where you're at on the planet. Mm-hmm. And then you want to think about how you provide for water and energy sources with what you need. It's fitting that in ecologically and matching that to what your capacities are.
You definitely touched on something that I think it's very rare to get the opportunity to start from scratch. And, certainly expensive and has its own drawbacks starting with nothing. It's nice to have something to work off the back of, but then that often means that we're not working with the ideal. And that's just where we are.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So it's a good point to say part of talking about livelihood is taking permaculture design and the design process and looking at your life, right? And assessing what is the landscape like, what are the resources available, what are the problems and challenges.
And matching that with what you need.
Yeah. There's a local solar advocacy group, and they say, first off, try to cut back your energy needs by 30% before you try to afford a solar installation. Mm-hmm. And because automatically you have reduced the cost of what you need by at least that much.
And to touch back on what you were just saying, I think that when it comes to design, a lot of people will look at just basic terrestrial space, but when you leave yourself out of it, that to me is a type 1 error. You have to bring your needs and your considerations into that design for it to really be fully featured.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would say, even small residential systems, so we're going to talk about this, I'm sure, but when we talk about designing a livelihood, sometimes people want to go whole hog and just, give up the day job and live in the system and all of that, and it's super challenging. So part of designing what you're going to do and designing your livelihood is thinking, if I spend an hour a day, what can I manage and keep my day job for now? In creating strategies that transition you from one thing to another slowly.
Absolutely. I think that there's a real all or nothing thing that hits us. And I'm no less guilty of it. When I first came out of my PDC, I was, first thing was, all right, how do I unplug from all this and get my acreage out in the sticks where I have no experience? and start doing this. But I think that it's when reality sets in after a while, you sort of reassess, and ultimately it's the same succession principle. You're going to look at it over time and try to scale it in a way that's manageable. And it might not always be as hard of a transition as you're expecting.
Mm-hmm.
Especially when you scale it on such a long time frame. Mm-hmm. When I kind of woke up about this kind of thing, I kind of settled on it on like a 10-year plan. That's not unreasonable. Mm-hmm. 10 years to transition from working a day job to, whatever your livelihood might be. And in some cases, people even stack them. And they always have a day job, and they put the livelihood in the off hours.
Right.
So going on to the next slide, I think it's useful to talk about what your life is like, and what are the situations, the places that you put yourself in. What's the texture? You spend your days in an office. Are you out in the landscape, or you have a workshop? Are you working with your children? There's a lot of different ways that we can work this kind of texture of our lives. And so thinking about, maybe you don't get to where you want to go ultimately, but kind of painting a picture and aiming and seeing where that takes you.
Yeah, and it's easier if you're working with other people. Mm-hmm. All the principles come into play here. The small and slow solutions, finding the edges and working with them, thinking about diversity, all that comes into play. So if you have a partner and that partner is taking on a portion of what's happening, then that allows more flexibility.
Definitely. And even if you wind up in a 60-70% scenario where you get that far toward your goal, even if you don't make it all the way, it's substantially better than where you started.
That's right. I guess the other thing to say here is that principle of redundancy is having multiple streams of income, having multiple skill sets.
More and more important as time passes. Absolutely key to a very uncertain and unpredictable future scenario. It's going to be in everyone's best interest to know a little bit about a lot.
Mm-hmm. So we've been kind of playing around with this idea of there are certain opportunities in the urban environment, certain ones in the rural environment, and Suburbia has its own, mix of things going on. And permacultures have different opinions about each one.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and they suit different people in different stretches of their lives, right? Mm-hmm. Some people may benefit from the hustle and bustle and the concentration of resources and creativity that a city provides, whereas living in a rural setting might give you the space that you need to do some more extensive projects.
I think that perhaps the most fair thing to say about each of them is that each one of them has their own distinct advantages and disadvantages.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but the other thing to keep in mind is that each one needs to go through a transformation and a renaissance even in order to come fully alive and be of service in the permaculture utopia, or the thing that we're working toward in a more sustainable and just world. They need people to be committed to them and have a vision of what this place is transforming into.
Absolutely. I don't think that anyone can make an argument that in the current state that these things are in, they are incredibly dysfunctional. And we need to build that functionality back into them.
And reliant on finite resources.
Right. And in the current situation, they're very vulnerable to resource interruption.
Yes.
Each and every one of them. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So where are there opportunities for change?
I was wondering if this is a larger statement by Milton about this sort of Three's Company scenario.
Rooming up?
And the one question, am I Chrissy? That's all I want to know.
Whatever your situation, there are always opportunities for change. They may not lay in line with what the current paradigm is. So, everyone having their own apartment or own home, everyone having their own car, that might be something that we need to buck, those concepts, and either live more simply and smaller, or team up with our friends and share our living arrangements.
Yeah, put your hands together. Both of those are going to be required of us.
Yeah. And then just thinking about, it's unrealistic to go whole hog and say, well, I'm going to have nothing to do with the automobile. I'm going to ride my bike everywhere, and I'm not going to interact with anything that involves an automobile, because our entire civilization runs on the automobile, on trucking and materials, coming from afar. But we can take steps to meet our transportation needs with bicycles and other alternative means, public transportation or whatever.
Well, and I would say part of that assessment and part of that life design piece is just really figuring out what your aims, and back to that first slide with real needs. We need connection to other people. We need meaningful relationships. And we've defined that largely in terms of a nuclear family, but that's increasingly doesn't work for people, and for lots of different reasons. And even, I'll speak for myself. I will say that nuclear family is super challenging, a household of 2 adults and children, and trying to do, the modern world and make transformation happen. There are a lot of challenges. And it's, can be very isolating. So thinking about, what is it that you want to work toward? What is most satisfying to you? And allows you to live the ethics and live in integrity for yourself. And part of that might be looking at, and increasingly I see this come in around the edges with different permaculture schools, looking at training in entrepreneurial skills, leadership skills, things like that, goal setting, things that mainstream society might use, but they're valuable processes to kind of help you frame what you want in life and create a livelihood.
I also think that on that same note, that something that I don't feel we're giving enough attention to as a society, but something that I think is perhaps the most important thing that we need to touch on, is how we work with each other, how we connect socially and as a community. These are the things that I think that we're still struggling with on just that interpersonal communication, conflict resolution, how we connect, how we function. There's still so much alienation and isolation and social anxiety and just difficulty getting along with each other. And it's on such a huge scale. I mean, there's always silver linings. There's always little things that are developing that kind of restore your faith and give you hope. But there's so much work that needs to be done in that area that, to my mind, it's some of the most important work we'll do, because everything that we do is predicated on connecting.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I wanted to kind of hone in a little bit on what Rhonda said a minute ago. It's almost like our current life situation is designed to stress us to the point of all we can do is just keep up. And we can't make change or move forward at all because we're stressed. We're isolated to the point where we can't steward these beneficial relationships with our neighbors, with our friends, in a way that starts to create some alternative reality. We're just trying to keep up, right? Just trying to pay the bills and just trying to keep the family going and the house clean and keep food on the table and all those things. You almost could not design a better system for isolation and dysfunction.
For the results we have, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot, and this kind of is another nod toward the nature connection and art of mentoring, but bringing back the peacemaking traditions and practicing that for yourself and for others. Communal decision making and appreciation and gratitude. And we are taught that it's all about us. There's so much pressure on what are we going to do? Who are you is related to what you do in the world, not who you are as a person. And
or how you interact with your community.
Right. This idea that to truly live a gratifying life, a satisfying life, we might want to look beyond ourselves. And that's, I think, the people I see that are the most content are those that put themselves in service to something that connects them to other people and gives them meaning.
That's a word that I've been throwing around a lot, is service. And it really gives a direction where there was none. It's a really amazing way of thinking about the world and our role in it.
At the same time, there needs to be balance. Right? Like, you have to balance service to others with service to yourself. And
With self-care. Yeah.
absolutely.
That, I think, is reflected in the ethics.
Absolutely. In this context and for this purpose, I think the quality of your human relationships is paramount.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Because you actually need very few material things.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more.
So, in the next slide, I wanted to paint a picture of how much work is it to maintain this lifestyle on the left versus the one on the right. The lower your requirements for living, the less space you need to upkeep, the less and maintain, and the less things you have to upkeep and maintain, the more flexibility you have.
Actually, this, I think, makes Rhonda's last point perfectly. You do need very, very few material things. And the question that I would ask from these two pictures is, who do we think is happier?
Well, obviously the one with the rotating car. Do you see that?
Oh my God, is that for real?
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, and I think not just who's happier, but who's freer in life.
Well, one will get you the other generally, but
Yeah, it has more time to enjoy themselves.
Well, and if you had to leave your life, who would have the easier time? It's the flexibility, right?
who's
If you
more
need to-
agile? Exactly.
Yeah. Who's got the bigger mortgage?
Yeah.
Who has to work harder to maintain it?
Yeah.
Who gets to enjoy their space? Who has free time? Who can travel?
You know, I think I look at the picture on the left and I think that person has to meet their neighbor's expectations. Like, there's constant pressure for that, right?
Yep, You're not throwing garden beds on that front lawn, not in that neighborhood.
No.
So look for alternative arrangements. Help a friend, work together, find others with resources that need help. There are lots of opportunities out there, even if you don't feel immediately like they're available to you. You just need to start looking.
And you just might find that through that journey, what comes out for you can be so much higher in richness and yield than what you thought you'd get out of it. It's that connection and common purpose and working together with others that you just derive so much joy and meaning from. And I know that's been true in my own life.
So we mentioned this before, but it doesn't hurt to say it again, that having multiple streams of income based off of multiple skills, multiple ways of essentially moving through the world, is, I think, the future. And so you can start asking, well, what are your passions, your hobbies, and your joys? What drives you? And tap into those rather than just exploiting yourself for money, for a buck.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this picture of a super center where you can go and get everything, well, that's all imported from outside the community. But not everything that's in there, certainly a lot of what's in there isn't necessary or healthy for people. But there are critical items, and usually they're also the things you'd find in a locally owned hardware store. Those are the things that people need and will need for a long time. And so they're sort of safe things and good investments of time and energy to learn how to provide either for yourself or for others. Could be a small business that forms one stream of income for you.
It's a basic diversity principle in action. As we move forward, it's just going to be smart to diversify your skill set, have as many different ways to draw a livelihood as you can, and those skills can prove valuable on multiple levels and scales, which I think leads rather tidily into Milton's next slide.
Let's go there. Well, ultimately, the majority of our lives should eventually be connected directly to where we live. That's the future. And how do we make this happen or even start to work in that direction? I think it's quite a big challenge. We don't know what's going to happen, but we just got to ride the wave.
Surfing is such a good analogy for the uncertain future. You may not be able to see what's coming. You have a rough idea of it, but it's in the same way we were just talking about diverse skill sets and adapting to changes and shocks and whatever's coming at you. Surfing is a perfect analogy for it. You're just working with the energy that's there.
Yeah, I mentioned earlier having goals, and I used to ask students, this was primarily when I was working with college students, to set a 1 year, a 5 year, and a 20-year goal. And they were like, I have no idea what the world is going to be like in 20 years. Setting a goal for that far away just doesn't make any sense.
Right.
And, I could at that point go, yeah, that makes sense. Because, my husband and I got married and we were sort of like, here's plan A. Now we're on plan B. Now we're on plan double Z. Like life
Yep.
changes. And so just thinking about how to do that surfing and again, the resilience comes from good connections, strong skill sets, and anticipating change. So that 12th principle of use and respond to change. Look for the opportunity.
I wonder if, as those students of yours were thinking about a goal, they were really thinking about, like, well, a bigger house. If they were really grounded in kind of the current mindset, the current box, and thinking about, surfing. You're working with forces. You don't know what the next wave is going to look like. And so you're working on goals within yourself. If you had said 20 years ago, not that I'm going to have a house and a car and kids and this and that, but that I'm going to be a good gardener and I'm going to be fluent in 12 languages or, whatever your heart's desire is, but, focused more upon yourself and what you're going to be. Like, that's the only thing you really have control over is you. And this, where you live is really dependent upon the circumstances. What's around you is really dependent upon your luck, where you end up, and what happens there.
But also developing the skill to see what's useful around you, too. I mean, that's maybe the most critical assessment, and then putting it into practice, maybe the most powerful skill you could have.
I just see it being very focused through the person rather than the surroundings, the place, the stuff.
Right.
The same person in 10 different situations, if they have the skills to find what's valuable around them, can be successful in all 10 of those situations.
That adaptability is a very, very important skill in and of itself.
Well, so we've talked about livelihood, some different ideas to think about as you are thinking about your own future. I hope that as you move forward, you're thinking less about the specific things and more about how you're going to develop and be agile as you surf the wave.